All right, welcome and Felcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim here on November 22, the year 2020. This is my half-hour podcast with some stories and some yarns, historical information, some fantasies, and whatever else random thoughts pops into my head. Now, a few weeks ago, as you may recall, I did a commercial for Move Me Brightly, M-O-V-E, new word, M-E, and Brightly, B-R-I-G-H-T-L-Y. It's an organization in near Ann Arbor, Michigan that makes face masks for the pandemic and headbands and head coverings, and it's a part-time entrepreneurial enterprise by a nurse who works at a children's hospital in Ann Arbor, the children's hospital in Ann Arbor. And I did the commercial, and I'm going to talk about masks, not so much as part of the commercial, but I want to show you one of the masks she made. It's a wonderful mask. It's great for healthcare workers or just anybody trying to deal with the pandemic. All made out of recycled materials, and checking them out. Move Me Brightly on Facebook. There's some great products. And I, for one, up until now, always wear a mask when I leave the house. And I was a believer, I should say, that it was the smart, safe thing to do. But this week I had an epiphany. I've been listening to all those people, both before and after the election, and with the spike in coronavirus cases in the last several weeks. But I've been listening to people who have said that wearing a mask is a personal choice. It's a matter of personal freedom. And after some considerable thought, I now agree. Not wearing a mask it's an exercise of personal freedom. And so from now on, I'm not going to wear a mask. And I found that just the thought of that is exhilarating. Because suddenly, I'm no longer concerned with personal obligations and personal responsibility. I'm only concerned with my own personal freedom. And I just find that just like a load has been lifted off my shoulders. So I'm not going to wear a mask anymore. And I've been thinking about that. I just thought that I'm going to carry that whole notion of personal freedom and personal choice a step further. And by that I mean, and I may do this one at a time, but I'm going to do one more step, and maybe later I'll do yet another step in this personal choice, personal freedom mode that I am now in. So from now on, I'm no longer going to pay any attention to traffic lights. If I'm driving and ahead of me is an intersection and there's a traffic light and it's a green light, yellow light, red light, doesn't matter. I'm going to exercise my own personal choice. And when I reach that intersection, I'll decide whether I stop or whether I go. It'll be my personal choice, and I'll be exercising my personal freedom. No one's going to tell me anymore that I have to stop at a red light. I can make the choice. This is America, and I have the freedom to choose. Now, I recognize, obviously, that this might lead to a crash. I may be going through an intersection and the light is red, and at the same time, somebody's coming through the intersection kind of perpendicular to me with a green light. And we may have a crash. But the chances of that happening are pretty remote. And of course, I may get hurt in that kind of crash, as remote as it might be. But that's the risk I'm going to take. And I'm going to take personal responsibility for that choice that I make. Now, I also recognize that if there is a crash, someone else may be injured. But that's simply too bad. I mean, but think about it. What are the odds? Is one out of every 5 times I go through a red light, there'll be a crash and someone else will be hurt? Is it 1 out of 10 times? 1 out of 20 times that I go through a red light, someone will be hurt? But I think those odds that someone's going to be hurt by me going through a red light are pretty remote. And what are the chances that someone is killed by that kind of action on my part. My choice, I go through the red light, and someone dies as a result of it. Well, the chances of that are just so remote that it's not going to limit my personal freedom. And think about it a moment. Think about who I might crash into if I do go through a red light. It could be someone of any age. And there's a reasonable chance that, but a remote chance, that if I crashed into someone and killed someone in that kind of crash, there's a reasonable chance that that person would be an old person. And if I killed an old person by going through a red light in the exercise of my personal freedom, it really would not be that big a deal. Because after all, it's an old person and would not be living too many more years anyway. So the risk of me hitting and killing an old person is not enough for me to limit my personal freedom. And even if it's not an old person, chances are pretty good that if I run into somebody, kill somebody as we crash in an intersection, chances are pretty good that that would be a person with some sort of health issue. Maybe someone who's obese or has diabetes or has high blood pressure or suffering from cancer even. It may even be early stages of cancer where the other person doesn't even know it yet. Or maybe it'd be someone who smokes or somebody who drinks heavily or someone who's taking opioids. And these people, even if they're not old, these people are at high risk of dying anyway. So it would not be much of a tragedy if I crashed into them in the highway. And if I crashed into them on the highway and killed them, it's just that their death will be just a little bit premature. So again, not enough for me to limit my personal freedom. Now it's possible I could crash into a vehicle that had a child, or maybe hit a pedestrian child by me going through a red light. But what are the odds of that? They're very, very remote. And children are pretty resilient anyway. So if I hit a child by going through a red light, the chances of me causing that child's death are just so remote, so infinitesimal, that it's just not enough for me to limit my personal freedom. Perhaps the only risk to other people if I run a red light is that I could crash into a healthy adult. But a healthy adult is probably someone who could get out of the way as I'm going through the red light. And a healthy adult would probably survive a car crash like that. So frankly, I just don't see a downside at all that would cause me to limit the exercise of my personal freedom, my choice to either stop or go, no matter what the traffic light color is on. So that's my mantra. From now on, no more masks and no more red lights. And it just makes me feel wonderful to have exercised that personal choice. Maybe you should too. This may look like a big glass of gin, but it's a glass of water. Now, if you know me at all, you know that this was just my satirical response to the many, many brainless people out there who refuse to wear a mask and who think their personal freedom and the exercise of their personal choice is more important than their personal responsibility. And it's also my satirical response to the many, many politicians who are out there. People who have precious little brains between the ears. My father used to call people like that shit for brains. And the way he would pronounce it is he would use that as a single word with 3 syllables. And he would usually use that word as a noun. Like he would describe someone as, oh, he is shit for brains. And that's how he used the word. And there are many, many people out there who have shit for brains. And unfortunately, we have too many shit for brains governors. So, speaking of headless governors, I wanted to tell you a historical story about a headless governor. And by that I mean he was, not that he just had shit for brains, although he did have shit for brains, but that he became literally headless. I'll give you a little background for that. The McDonnell Clan Donald, which I wrote a book about, actually. You can see it right behind me. The Klan in the late 16th century fought a 20-year war with England. Now that's one clan, one Irish clan, in a war against the nation of England. And surprisingly, the war did not end with an English victory. The war ended in a draw. The two sides negotiated a peace. And under the peace is one of those negotiated pieces where both sides win. The McDonnells got to keep what they were fighting for. They got to keep their land. The glens of Antrim, most of what is now Antrim County, County Antrim, and some other lands nearby which were part of the McDonnell domain at the time. The McDonnells got to keep it, and the English recognized the McDonnells' rights to that land. And England got what it wanted. It wanted recognition as the sovereign over Ireland, or at least over Antrim. And the McDonnells recognized Queen Elizabeth, and recognized Queen Elizabeth as their queen, and they acknowledged that her successors would be the monarch over County Antrim and the McDonnell clan. And I may talk about that 20-year war in another podcast, because that's fascinating and some horrific aspects to it. But about a decade or so after that peace, another war broke out in Ireland. It was the bloodiest war ever fought on the island of Ireland. And it's called the 9 Years' War. 9 Years' War, and that's a funny name for a war, giving it a number. And it's even funnier in the fact that the war lasted 10 or 12 years. So I don't know how they came up with the name 9 Years' War, but they did. And it was a rebellion led by three Ulster clans: the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, and the Maguires. And within a few years of that rebellion, many clans all over Ireland joined in, and it was indeed an horrific affair. It spread to virtually the entire island of Ireland. But the McDonnells stayed out of it, at least initially. They honored their peace with the English. Now, the English governor of Carrickfergus at the time was John Chichester. And in light of the war raging elsewhere, one would think that Governor Chichester would be a bit diplomatic when dealing with the McDonnells. Again, trying to keep them out of the war. They were out of it, try to keep them out of it. But he made a couple of demands upon the McDonnells, which the McDonnells refused to comply. Decades earlier than this, there was a Spanish ship from the Spanish Armada that crashed into the shores of County Antrim, right about the place where of Dunluce Castle in Antrim. Now, the McDonnells rescued many Spanish sailors from that wreck. And they also salvaged a huge cannon that was aboard that Spanish ship. And they salvaged that cannon and they mounted it on the walls of Dunluce. So now Dunluce Castle, the McDonnell stronghold, the center of the McDonnell clan, now had a cannon, a Spanish cannon mounted on its walls for its additional protection. And I may talk about the Spanish Armada. In fact, I think I will in a future podcast, because there's a fascinating story as well about the interaction of the Spanish who crashed into Ireland, both the north and west coast of Ireland, after their failed attempt to invade England. But a fascinating story. So that'll be another podcast coming up. But Chichester demanded that the McDonnells remove that cannon from Dunluce and deliver it to Carrickfergus, because he wanted, the McDonnells is the one that salvaged the cannon, but Chichester wanted it for Carrickfergus. Now, when he made that demand for the cannon, the McDonnells responded. To use the parlance of the era, they basically told Chichester to fuck off. And they refused to turn over the cannon. Now, the McDonnells had some other run-ins with the English during this period, and by run-ins, what I mean is the English sent tax collectors into Antrim, and McDonnell warriors ran them off. We're a bit rude to these English tax collectors. So Chichester thought that the McDonnells, particularly their chief, James McDonnell, were being disloyal to England by running off tax collectors and not turning over the Spanish cannon to the English governor. So Chichester summoned James McDonnell to meet with him in Carrickfergus. This was in November in the year 1597. Now James showed up, but he didn't come alone. He brought with him his clan army. And they stopped a few miles short of Carrickfergus. And then Chichester rode out of Carrickfergus to meet him, and he brought with him his English army that he had within his command at Carrickfergus. And the two sides met on opposite sides of a field in this day in November of 1797. And they sent messengers back and forth, and it was pretty clear that both sides were equally ready for a negotiation and equally ready for a battle. Now, as these negotiations didn't seem to get anywhere, Chichester just grew a bit irritated with the progress. And he was also irritated with the show of force, because he presumed that James McDonnell would come to Carrickfergus alone. So Chichester turned to his second in command, and he told him, and these are his exact words, he says, "Give them a charge, so that we might have a good killing upon them, or at least a good run out of them." So Chichester decided to attack the McDonnells, and he clearly underestimated the McDonnells' battle skills, and he probably overestimated that of his own army, because many of his soldiers had just arrived at Carrickfergus after a 2-day march in the rain, in the cold of November. And their powder was still wet in the old muskets of the era. You have to keep your powder dry. And they were wet from that long march they had to get to Carrickfergus. But with that order, half of the English cavalry charged towards the McDonnells. The other half either stood still or turned around and went back to Carrickfergus. They ignored the order. Chichester then ordered his foot soldiers to attack, which most of them did. But their powder was wet, and so the English muskets were virtually useless in the attack. So the McDonnells were defending the attack, but then they attacked themselves, not in the front, but at both flanks. So the English were being stopped at the front and attacked at both flanks, and without dry powder for their muskets. So the English basically turned and ran. Now, Chichester was behind all of this, watching it happen. He had been shot in the leg during the fighting, even though he was behind the lines. But as his soldiers turned and started running back towards him, he grabbed his sword and he slashed at and killed one of his own men for retreating. But shortly after that, Carrickfergus turned and headed back. Chichester turned and headed back to Carrickfergus. And on his way back, about halfway there, on the way back, he was shot in the head and died. Fell off his horse. Now, in the battle, the numbers were essentially about 170 English soldiers were killed in that battle, and another 30 or 40 were wounded. Some of them made it directly back to Carrickfergus. Many others ran into the woods and into rivers just to hide from the McDonnells. And they made it back to Carrickfergus kind of one by one over the next 2 or 3 days. They kind of filtered back into town. Now, during that period of time, English soldiers were filtering back into town. The McDonnells delivered the bodies of John Chichester and his second in command to Carrickfergus. But both bodies were headless. Now, again, they didn't lose their head in battle. They lost it after they had died. Someone cut off their heads. Now, there are many, many stories about what happened to the head of John Chichester, the English governor of Carrickfergus. Many stories about what may have happened to that head. Because the headless portion, the rest of this body, was delivered to Carrickfergus. But what happened to his head? Now, the most believable story that came out of that affair, I got a dog who just came in, wanted to hear the story. Dog came in to say hi to me during my podcast. Now, the most believable story is that the McDonnells gave the head to the O'Neills, who were fighting the war against the English, and that the head of John Chichester was used as a ball in an early form of Gaelic football. Brings football to a whole new level, I think. Now, shortly after that battle, which was not far from Carrickfergus, a bit west of Carrickfergus, a French ship landed near Carrickfergus, a little north, a few miles north of Carrickfergus, the fortress of Carrickfergus. And he landed at a spot where there was a few houses, there was a shop or two. It wasn't much there, except a pier where a ship could not land, but at least bring its longboat out from aboard the ship. So it was just a small area there. And the French captain, when he got off his ship and got off the pier and landed there, he said, and I quote, "I have never seen such a bonny place before. I have never seen such a bonny place before." Now, over time, that area kind of grew into a village. There was more homes, there were some shops, and it eventually became somewhat of its own village, its own settlement. And the people there named their village Bonnie Before, shortening the quote of the French sea captain. Now, over time, Carrickfergus kind of grew beyond the fortress into the community surrounding the fortress, and eventually grew to where it included the village, the old village of Bonnie Before. So Bonnie Before was no longer a separate village, but part of Carrickfergus. So while a village doesn't exist, there's still a street where the village was, and that street name is called Bonnie Before. Now, if you were paying attention last week, I mentioned Bonnie Before Street, because there's a home on Bonnie Before Street, which was the home of Andrew and Elizabeth Jackson. And 2 of their 3 sons were born there, Hugh Jackson and Robert Jackson. They had a 3rd son who may have been born there, and this 3rd son was also named Andrew Jackson. And that 3rd son may have been born in that home in Carrickfergus. There's some thoughts he may have been born aboard ship as the entire family moved out of Carrickfergus and moved to the Carolinas. Although it's probably most likely that he was born after the whole family arrived in North America to a little settlement on the border of North and South Carolina. That he was probably born there in the Carolinas. Now, again, if you were paying attention last week, that Andrew Jackson became the 7th president of the United States, who lived on Bonnie Before Street. where the French captain had landed and actually named the community. So that's essentially the end of this podcast. I want to remind you to take a look at clandonald.net. It's a brand new website. Just came live over the weekend. Google Clandonald. This is how you spell it. Clandonnell. And it's clandonald.net. And the new website will pop up. And I think it's brilliant. It looks really wonderful. And I can't take the credit. It was done by Connor Mallon Productions, a website developer and software engineer who lives in Armagh, Northern Ireland. I'm going to spend most of the next week, and maybe most of the rest of my life, I think, adding content to that website. And I'll do my best not to clutter up the site because it looks brilliant right now. But I'm a writer, so I write. And when I write, I want it posted. I want it out there. But I'll try to do it in a way that doesn't clutter up the website. But take a look at it in the meantime, because it does look nice, and it's very easy to navigate. And also send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Just say hi, but also send me suggestions for a future podcast. I got some that are kind of on my to-do list that I want to do at a future podcast. But if you send me a request, I'm sure I can fit it in. Take a look at my Facebook page, Clandonald. Just put Clandonald in the search box of Facebook. I'm not yet on TikTok or a whole variety of other social media, but I am on Facebook. Take a look at my books, By the Horse of Guinness and Clandonald. And of course, please remember, despite what I said earlier about people with shit for brains, please stay safe, stay smart, and do the right thing. So that's all for now. Goodbye.